The makeshift operating table was slick with blood, and the wounded Japanese soldier's breathing was growing shallow. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura had been shot through the abdomen during the fierce fighting on Iwo Jima in February 1945, and as American forces dragged him from the sulfur-stained battlefield, he closed his eyes and waited to die. Every Japanese soldier knew the stories. Captured enemies were left to bleed out, or worse, tortured for information before execution. But when Nakamura opened his eyes in that dim canvas tent, he saw something that defied everything he'd been taught about American barbarism. A U.S. Army surgeon rolling up his sleeves, preparing to operate on the very man who'd been trying to kill him hours earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima was hell on earth in early 1945. For 36 days, American Marines and Japanese defenders had torn each other apart across 8 square miles of black sand and jagged rock. The air reeked of cordite, sulfur, and death. In the tunnels and bunkers carved deep into the volcanic stone, Japanese soldiers had prepared for their final stand, following the Bushido code that death was preferable to the shame of surrender. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, a 26-year-old former teacher from Hiroshima, had been manning a machine gun nest when the American assault began at dawn on February 23rd. His position, carved into the slopes of Mount Suribachi, had a commanding view of the beach where thousands of Marines were storming ashore. For hours, he and his men had poured devastating fire into the advancing Americans, watching young men fall like wheat before a scythe. But the Americans kept coming. Wave after wave of Marines, their green uniforms soon stained with volcanic ash and blood, pushed forward with a determination that both impressed and terrified Nakamura. He had been taught that Americans were soft, that they would break under pressure. Yet here they were, advancing through hellish fire, dragging their wounded to safety, never retreating. The explosion that ended Nakamura's war came without warning. A Marine demolition team had worked their way around his position, and the blast from their satchel charge brought down half the bunker. Nakamura felt the searing pain in his abdomen as shrapnel tore through him, and then everything went dark. When consciousness returned, Nakamura found himself being carried on a stretcher by 2 American Marines. His first instinct was to struggle, to fight, but his body wouldn't obey. The pain in his gut was excruciating, and he could feel his life's blood seeping through the crude field dressing someone had applied to his wound. The Marines carrying him were just boys, really. One couldn't have been more than 19, with freckles across his sunburned nose. The other was older, maybe 25, with kind eyes that seemed incongruous with the rifle slung across his back. They spoke to each other in low voices as they navigated the treacherous volcanic terrain, but their words were gentle, not the harsh barking Nakamura had expected from enemy soldiers. "Easy does it, Tommy," the older Marine said to his companion. "This one's hurt bad. Doc's gonna need to work fast." Nakamura understood enough English to catch the meaning, and it puzzled him. Why were they taking care to avoid jarring his wounds? Why weren't they letting him die or finishing him off? In his fevered state, he began to wonder if this was some elaborate form of torture, keeping him alive just long enough to extract information before execution. But when Nakamura opened his eyes in that dim canvas tent, he saw something that defied everything he'd been taught about American barbarism. A U.S. Army surgeon rolling up his sleeves, preparing to operate on the very man who'd been trying to kill him hours earlier. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The American aid station was unlike anything Nakamura had imagined. Set up in a natural depression in the volcanic rock, it was a bustling hub of medical activity. Canvas tents stretched in orderly rows, and the sound of generators provided a steady hum of electricity for the surgical lights. Most shocking of all were the American medics, dozens of them, working with methodical efficiency to treat the wounded. What struck Nakamura most was that they were treating everyone. Japanese wounded lay on stretchers alongside American Marines, receiving the same urgent care, the same gentle handling. A Navy corpsman, his uniform stained with blood from a dozen different patients, was carefully inserting an IV into the arm of a Japanese sergeant who'd been unconscious since his capture. Dr. William Patterson, the chief surgeon, was a tall, lean man from Minnesota who'd been practicing medicine for 15 years before the war. His hands were steady as a surgeon should be, but his eyes held a weariness that spoke of too many young men lost, too many operations performed under impossible conditions. When the Marines carried Nakamura into the triage area, Patterson took one look at the Japanese officer's wounds and made his assessment. He's got internal bleeding, probably a perforated bowel. We need to get him into surgery immediately if we're going to save him. Morrison, a young doctor from California who'd volunteered for Navy service straight out of medical school, looked uncertain. "Sir, are you sure? I mean, he's enemy."
Patterson cut him off with a sharp look. "He's a patient, Commander. That's all I see." The decision to operate on enemy wounded was not taken lightly by American medical personnel. Supplies were always short on the front lines, and every hour spent on a Japanese soldier was an hour that might be needed for an American Marine. But Dr. Patterson had taken an oath, and in his mind, that oath transcended nationality. As Nakamura was wheeled toward the surgical tent, he caught glimpses of the organized chaos around him. American medics moved with practiced efficiency, triaging the wounded, administering morphine, preparing patients for surgery. What amazed him was the lack of hatred in their faces. These were men who had just been in life-or-death combat, who had lost friends and comrades to Japanese bullets and grenades, yet they worked on Japanese wounded with the same professional dedication they showed their own. The anesthesiologist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Robert Callahan, leaned over Nakamura as they prepared him for surgery. "Don't worry, soldier," he said in halting Japanese, learned from a phrase book. "We're going to take care of you." Nakamura stared up at him in amazement. This American doctor had taken the time to learn Japanese phrases, not for interrogation, but for comfort. It was a small gesture, but it shattered another piece of the propaganda Nakamura had been fed about American barbarism. As the ether mask descended over his face, Nakamura's last conscious thought was a question that would haunt him for years to come. Who were these Americans really? The surgical tent was a marvel of field medicine. Despite being set up on a volcanic island in the middle of a raging battle, it was equipped with everything needed for major surgery. Electric lights powered by generators illuminated the operating table. Surgical instruments gleamed in sterile trays, and bottles of precious whole blood hung from IV stands. Dr. Patterson scrubbed his hands methodically, the same ritual he had performed thousands of times in hospitals back home in Minneapolis. Beside him, his surgical team prepared with the same careful attention to detail. This was their fourth surgery of the day, and it was only noon. "What's his story?" Patterson asked as he examined Nakamura's wounds. "Machine gunner from one of the bunkers on Suribachi," replied the Marine who had helped carry him in. "Put up a hell of a fight. Must have been out there for hours before our boys got to him." Patterson nodded grimly. He had operated on dozens of Japanese soldiers since the invasion began, and each one told a story of fanatical resistance. These men fought with a desperation and courage that commanded respect, even from their enemies. "All right, let's see what we're dealing with," murmured as he made his initial incision. What he found inside Nakamura's abdomen was worse than he had expected. Shrapnel had perforated the small intestine in multiple places, and internal bleeding was severe. In a civilian hospital, with unlimited time and resources, it would be a challenging operation. Here, with the sound of artillery still rumbling in the distance and supplies running low, it seemed nearly impossible. But Dr. Patterson had not saved the lives of hundreds of Marines by accepting defeat. Working with methodical precision, he began the delicate process of repairing the damaged tissue, removing shrapnel, and stopping the bleeding that was slowly draining away Nakamura's life. The operation lasted 3 hours, an eternity in field surgery conditions. Dr. Patterson worked with the focused intensity that had made him one of the most respected surgeons in the Pacific Theater. His assistant, Commander Morrison, initially nervous about operating on an enemy soldier, found himself caught up in the familiar rhythm of surgery, handing instruments and suturing with the same care he would show for any patient. The complexity of Nakamura's injuries required every bit of Patterson's skill. The shrapnel had caused multiple perforations of the bowel, requiring careful excision of damaged tissue and meticulous reconstruction of the digestive tract. Each suture had to be perfect. Infection was a constant threat in the tropical environment, and any surgical error could prove fatal. "Pressure's dropping," announced Corpsman Third Class David Wilson, monitoring Nakamura's vital signs. Wilson was a 20-year-old from Oregon who had learned battlefield medicine through brutal experience. He had seen too many good men die on his operating table, and despite the fact that this patient was Japanese, he found himself silently willing the wounded soldier to survive. "Give him another unit of blood," Patterson ordered, not looking up from his work. Whole blood was precious in the Pacific. Every pint had to be flown in from field hospitals in Hawaii or Australia. Using it on an enemy soldier was controversial, but Patterson had stopped thinking of Nakamura as Japanese. He was simply a young man with a terrible wound who deserved the same chance at life as any other patient. The turning point came when Patterson located the main source of internal bleeding, a severed artery that had been spurting blood into Nakamura's abdominal cavity. Working quickly but carefully, he clamped the vessel and began the delicate process of surgical repair. "That should do it," he said finally, stepping back from the table. "Let's close him up and see if he makes it through the night." When Nakamura awoke 12 hours later, the first thing he noticed was the absence of pain. The agonizing fire in his abdomen had been replaced by a dull, manageable ache. The second thing he noticed was that he was alive, something he had not expected when he lost consciousness on the operating table.
He found himself in a recovery tent filled with wounded soldiers, both American and Japanese. The mixing of enemies in the same medical facility would have been unthinkable to military commanders on either side, but in the practical world of battlefield medicine, wounded men were simply wounded men. A Navy corpsman named Petty Officer Second Class Frank O'Brien was checking on patients, changing dressings, and administering medications. O'Brien was a burly Irishman from Boston who had learned to speak basic Japanese during his medical training. When he saw that Nakamura was conscious, he approached with a cup of water. "How are you feeling?" O'Brien asked in broken but understandable Japanese. Nakamura stared at him in confusion. Not only had these Americans operated to save his life, but they were now providing post-operative care with the same attention they gave their own wounded. It defied everything he had been taught about American barbarism and disregard for human life. "Why?" Nakamura whispered, the single word carrying all of his confusion and disbelief. O'Brien seemed to understand the deeper question behind the simple word. He sat down on the edge of a nearby cot and looked thoughtfully at the Japanese officer. "Doc says you're a teacher back home," O'Brien said. "I'm a teacher too, or was before all this. 2nd grade in Southie. Kids are kids, you know? Doesn't matter where they come from." The comparison struck Nakamura like a physical blow. This American corpsman saw him not as a faceless enemy, but as a fellow human being with a profession, a life, probably a family back home. It was a perspective that Japanese propaganda had never allowed for, the idea that enemies could be individuals with hopes, dreams, and humanity. Over the following days, as Nakamura slowly recovered from his surgery, he found himself drawn into conversations with the American medical staff. These men, who should have been his mortal enemies, treated him with a mixture of professional care and genuine curiosity about his life and background. Dr. Patterson made rounds twice daily, checking on all his surgical patients, regardless of nationality. During one visit, he sat down beside Nakamura's cot and asked about his work as a teacher. "What did you teach?" Patterson asked, through O'Brien, who served as translator. "Mathematics and literature," Nakamura replied, still somewhat incredulous that an American doctor was making casual conversation with him. "At a middle school in Hiroshima."
Patterson nodded thoughtfully. My daughter's about that age, 12 years old. She's terrible at mathematics but loves to read. I imagine your students miss you. The simple humanity of the comment nearly brought tears to Nakamura's eyes. When was the last time anyone had asked about his students or acknowledged that he had a life beyond the war? In the Imperial Army, soldiers were expected to leave their civilian identities behind, to become instruments of the Emperor's will. But this American doctor saw him as a person first, a soldier second. Such conversations were happening throughout the medical facility. American medics and Japanese patients, despite the language barrier, found ways to communicate about their homes, their families, their hopes for the future. A Marine corpsman from Nebraska showed photographs of his farm to a Japanese sergeant who had grown rice before the war. A Navy pharmacist's mate shared stories about his medical training with a Japanese medic who had worked in a Tokyo hospital. These exchanges were small, seemingly insignificant, but they had a profound effect on both sides. For the Americans, they humanized an enemy that propaganda had painted as fanatical and inhuman. For the Japanese, they revealed Americans as individuals with the same hopes, fears, and basic decency that they recognized in themselves. What was happening in that American field hospital on Iwo Jima was part of a larger phenomenon that occurred throughout the Pacific War, though it was rarely reported in newspapers or acknowledged in official histories. American medical personnel, bound by the Hippocratic Oath and their professional ethics, consistently provided care to enemy wounded despite official policies that gave priority to American casualties. The numbers, when viewed objectively, were staggering. During the battle for Iwo Jima alone, American medical units treated over 800 Japanese wounded, men who, according to their own military doctrine, should have died rather than surrender. These operations required precious medical supplies, skilled surgical time, and hospital beds that could have been used for American casualties. Yet the treatment continued, driven by medical professionals who saw their duty as transcending national boundaries. Lieutenant Nakamura learned these statistics during his recovery, passed along through whispered conversations with other Japanese patients. The scope of American medical care for enemy wounded was almost impossible to comprehend. How could a nation that was locked in total war, fighting for its very survival, spare resources to save the lives of men who had been trying to kill their soldiers just hours before? The answer, Nakamura came to realize, lay in the fundamental differences between American and Japanese military culture. While the Imperial Japanese Army taught that death was preferable to dishonor, American military medicine was built on the principle that every life had value. It was a philosophy that extended even to enemies, even in the midst of the most brutal conflict in human history. As the days passed, Nakamura found his carefully constructed worldview crumbling, piece by piece. Everything he had been taught about American barbarism, about their disregard for human life, about their fundamental inhumanity, was being contradicted by daily experience. The Americans were not the demons of Japanese propaganda. They were young men, many of them barely out of their teens, who wrote letters home to their mothers, carried photographs of their sweethearts, and worried about their futures after the war. They complained about the food, joked about their officers, and counted the days until they could return to civilian life. More disturbing still was the realization that these Americans seemed to possess a moral clarity that was absent from his own military experience. While Japanese soldiers were taught to die for the emperor without question, American soldiers seemed to fight for more tangible ideals, for their families, their communities, their right to live free from oppression. Dr. Patterson, during one of his rounds, shared a letter he had received from his wife back in Minnesota. She wrote about their daughter's school play, about the victory garden they were tending, about her work at a defense plant. It was a glimpse into a world where life continued, where people still found joy and meaning despite the war raging across the globe. "What are you fighting for?" Nakamura asked Patterson one evening, the question coming out in halting English he had been practicing with O'Brien. Patterson considered the question seriously. "So my daughter can grow up in a world where people can live as they choose," he said finally. where teachers can teach, doctors can heal, and children can play without fear. It was such a simple answer, yet it revealed a philosophy that was entirely foreign to Nakamura's military training. He had been taught to fight for abstract concepts, for the honor of the emperor, for the glory of Japan, for the expansion of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But Patterson was fighting for something much more personal and immediate, for the right of ordinary people to live ordinary lives. The impact of American medical care extended far beyond the individual Japanese soldiers who received treatment. Word of American medical facilities spread through the Japanese defensive network on Iwo Jima, carried by wounded soldiers who had been treated and returned to Japanese lines during prisoner exchanges. These reports created confusion and doubt among Japanese troops who had been prepared for a final glorious death. If the Americans were treating Japanese wounded with the same care they gave their own soldiers, what did that say about the nature of their enemy? Were these really the barbarians that Japanese propaganda had portrayed? For some Japanese soldiers, knowledge of American medical care became a factor in their decision to surrender rather than fight to the death. This was particularly true among the wounded, who faced the choice between certain death in Japanese positions without medical care or possible survival in American custody. The psychological impact was profound. Generations of Japanese soldiers had been conditioned to believe that capture meant torture, humiliation, and death. The reality of American medical care shattered these beliefs, creating cognitive dissonance that some soldiers found impossible to reconcile with their training. Nakamura witnessed several instances where newly captured Japanese soldiers arrived at the aid station in states of near panic, convinced that they were about to be tortured or executed. Their transformation, as they realized they were receiving genuine medical care, was remarkable to witness. Fear gave way to confusion, confusion to grudging acceptance, and in some cases, acceptance to something approaching gratitude. As Nakamura's strength returned, he began to contemplate what lay ahead. He was now a prisoner of war, facing an uncertain future in American custody. By all rights, he should be dead. The wounds he had sustained were severe enough that he would not have survived without immediate surgical intervention. Yet, here he was, recovering in an American hospital, his life saved by men who had every reason to let him die. The contradiction was so profound that it challenged not just his understanding of Americans, but his understanding of war itself, of humanity, of the fundamental nature of moral choice. Other Japanese patients in the recovery ward were grappling with similar questions. Lieutenant Keisuke Harada, a pilot who had been shot down during a kamikaze attack, spent hours staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile his mission to die for the emperor with the fact that American doctors had saved his life after his plane crashed. Sergeant Takeshi Yamada, wounded during the defense of the beach, could not understand why American medics had risked their own lives to pull him from a burning pillbox. These men had been prepared for death, had accepted it, in some cases, had actively sought it. Now they found themselves alive, healing, forced to confront a future they had never imagined. It was a gift they had not asked for, from enemies they had been taught to despise. But the most profound revelation was still to come. In the days ahead, as these Japanese prisoners recovered from their wounds, they would discover truths about America, about humanity, and about themselves that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the world. What Lieutenant Nakamura and his fellow prisoners discovered next would shake them to their very core, revealing truths about their captors and about themselves that would change everything they believed about war, honor, and what it truly means to be human.
The moment that changed everything came 2 weeks into Nakamura's recovery. He had been moved to a larger medical facility on Guam, where American doctors continued his post-operative care with the same dedication they showed their own wounded. The facility was a marvel of American medical capability, clean, well-equipped, staffed with specialists who had been flown in from hospitals across the Pacific. It was there that Nakamura witnessed something that broke him completely. A young American Marine, Private First Class Timothy Fletcher from Kansas, had been brought in with wounds eerily similar to Nakamura's own. Fletcher was 19 years old, with sandy hair and freckles, and he was dying from the same type of abdominal trauma that should have killed the Japanese lieutenant. But there was a crucial difference. Fletcher was American, and the medical resources available to save him were virtually unlimited. Dr. Patterson, who had continued overseeing Nakamura's care, immediately scrubbed in to operate on the young Marine. Nakamura watched from his hospital bed as teams of specialists mobilized, as precious blood supplies were rushed to the operating room, as the entire facility focused its energy on saving one of their own. But here was what shattered Nakamura's understanding of everything. Dr. Patterson performed the exact same operation on Fletcher that he had performed on Nakamura 2 weeks earlier. The same careful surgical technique, the same attention to detail, the same determination to save a life. There was no difference in the quality of care, no holding back of expertise or resources when it came to treating the enemy. As Fletcher was wheeled into surgery, Nakamura realized with crushing clarity that Dr. Patterson had not saved his life as an act of propaganda or psychological warfare. The American surgeon had simply seen a wounded human being and done what his training, his oath, and his conscience demanded. The same level of care that any American soldier would receive had been given freely to an enemy who had been shooting at Americans just hours before. The realization left Nakamura trembling in his hospital bed, tears streaming down his face for the first time since childhood. In the days that followed Fletcher's successful surgery, Nakamura found himself observing the American medical staff with new eyes. These were not the soulless automatons of Japanese propaganda, nor were they the crude barbarians he had been taught to expect. They were skilled professionals who approached their work with a combination of scientific precision and genuine compassion that transcended nationality. Corman O'Brien, who had become something of a friend during Nakamura's recovery, noticed the change in the Japanese officer's demeanor. "You seem different," O'Brien observed during one of his rounds, speaking in the broken Japanese that had improved considerably over the weeks. "More troubled?" Nakamura struggled to find words for what he was experiencing. How could he explain that everything he had believed about Americans, about the war, about the nature of good and evil, was crumbling around him? "Your people," Nakamura said slowly in English, "they save enemies. Why?" O'Brien sat down on the edge of the bed, considering the question seriously. "You know what Doc Patterson told me when I asked him the same thing? He said, when someone's bleeding on my cable, I don't see American or Japanese or German. I see someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father, and it's my job to send them home if I can." The words hit Nakamura like a physical blow. Someone's son. That's exactly what he was, the beloved only child of parents in Hiroshima who had no idea whether he was alive or dead. Dr. Patterson had seen that, had recognized his fundamental humanity and acted to preserve it even though Nakamura was his enemy. But the revelation went deeper than individual compassion. As Nakamura observed the workings of the American military medical system, he began to understand that what he was witnessing was not the exception, but the rule. This was how Americans approached warfare, with a fundamental respect for human life that persisted even in the midst of the most brutal conflict in human history. As Nakamura's strength returned, he was allowed to move more freely around the medical facility, always under guard, but treated more as a recovering patient than a prisoner. What he saw during these walks challenged every assumption he had held about American society and values. The sheer abundance was staggering. Medical supplies that would have been considered precious beyond measure in Japanese facilities were used routinely and discarded after single use, Bandages, syringes, surgical instruments, all were treated as disposable commodities. The pharmacy held stocks of medications that exceeded what most Japanese military hospitals possessed in total. But it wasn't just the material abundance that shocked Nakamura. It was the attitude of the American personnel toward their resources. There was no hoarding, no careful rationing of precious supplies. If a patient needed something, it was provided without question or delay. The assumption seemed to be that America's industrial capacity was so vast that medical needs would always be met. More disturbing still was what Nakamura observed about American military hierarchy. Japanese military culture was built on absolute obedience, unquestioning submission to authority, and the complete suppression of individual opinion. But American soldiers seemed to operate under an entirely different system. He watched in amazement as enlisted men openly disagreed with officers, as medical personnel challenged orders they felt were medically unsound, as individuals at every level expressed opinions and concerns without fear of punishment. A Navy pharmacist mate had an animated discussion with a Marine captain about the best treatment for a particular infection. A corpsman questioned a doctor's diagnosis and suggested an alternative approach. Most shocking of all, these exchanges were not only tolerated but seemed to be encouraged.
"How can your army function?" Nakamura asked O'Brien one day, after witnessing a particularly spirited debate between medical personnel about treatment protocols. O'Brien laughed. "That's not argument, that's discussion. We believe the best ideas come from letting everyone have their say. Even the lowest-ranking sailor might know something that could save lives." The concept was revolutionary to Nakamura. In the Imperial Japanese Army, junior officers never questioned senior decisions, and enlisted men existed solely to obey orders. The idea that wisdom might flow upward from the ranks, that individual insight might be valued over rigid hierarchy, was completely foreign to his experience. As weeks turned into months, deeper relationships began to form between Nakamura and his American caregivers. These connections went beyond the professional courtesy he had initially experienced, evolving into something resembling genuine friendship. Dr. Patterson, despite his demanding surgical schedule, began stopping by Nakamura's bed not just for medical checks, but for conversations about their respective backgrounds. The American surgeon was fascinated by Nakamura's descriptions of Japanese education, particularly his methods for teaching mathematics to reluctant students. "You know," Patterson said one evening, "my daughter Susan is struggling with algebra. I think she'd benefit from some of the approaches you've described." The casual way Patterson spoke about his family, sharing details about his daughter's academic struggles with an enemy officer, exemplified the trust and openness that Nakamura found so difficult to comprehend. In Japanese military culture, personal information was closely guarded, shared only with the most trusted comrades. Yet Patterson spoke about his family as naturally as he might discuss the weather. These personal revelations worked both ways. As Nakamura became more comfortable with English, he found himself sharing stories about his own life, his students in Hiroshima, his aging parents, his love of literature and poetry. The Americans listened with genuine interest, asking questions about Japanese culture and society that revealed a curiosity and respect that contradicted everything Nakamura had been taught about American attitudes toward Asia. Corpsman Wilson, who had monitored Nakamura's vital signs during that first crucial surgery, turned out to be an aspiring teacher himself. He and Nakamura spent hours discussing educational philosophy, comparing American and Japanese approaches to childhood learning. Wilson shared his dreams of opening a school in rural Oregon after the war, while Nakamura described his hopes of returning to his classroom in Hiroshima. "War's gotta end sometime. When it does, we'll need teachers more than we need soldiers." The comment stuck with Nakamura. Here was an American who saw beyond the current conflict, who envisioned a future where former enemies might share common goals and purposes. It was a perspective that Japanese military doctrine actively discouraged. The war was supposed to be total, eternal, a fundamental clash between incompatible civilizations. As Nakamura learned more about the scope of American medical care for enemy wounded, the numbers became almost incomprehensible. During his recovery, he spoke with dozens of other Japanese prisoners who had been treated in American facilities. Their stories revealed a pattern of medical care that extended across the entire Pacific theater. On Saipan, American doctors had treated over 600 Japanese wounded. On Okinawa, the number exceeded 1,000. Across the Pacific, thousands of Japanese soldiers, men who should have died from their wounds according to their own military doctrine, had been saved by American medical intervention. The resources committed to this care were staggering. Each major surgery required hours of skilled physician time, expensive medical supplies, and precious hospital space. The blood alone, thousands of pints of whole blood flown in from the United States, represented an investment in enemy lives that seemed to defy military logic. But what troubled Nakamura most was the contrast with Japanese medical practices. He had witnessed Japanese field hospitals where wounded soldiers were sometimes left to die if their treatment would consume too many resources needed for those who could quickly return to combat. The concept of unlimited medical care, of treating every wounded person regardless of their prospects for military usefulness, was alien to Japanese military medicine. The moral implications were profound. If Americans were willing to expend precious resources saving enemy lives, what did that say about Japanese propaganda claims that Americans were fundamentally evil? If American doctors saw Japanese soldiers as human beings worthy of care and respect, how could the war be the moral crusade that Japanese leaders claimed it to be? These questions haunted Nakamura as he recovered. Every interaction with American personnel, every observation of their values and priorities chipped away at the ideological foundation that had supported his entire adult life. Now, I want you to consider something that Nakamura grappled with every day during his recovery. He had been taught his entire life that Americans were his mortal enemies, that they were fundamentally different from Japanese people, that they represented everything evil and corrupt in the world. But his direct experience told a completely different story. How often in our own lives do we hold strong beliefs about people we've never actually met? How many of our opinions about the other side, whether political, cultural, or social, are based on what we've been told rather than what we've experienced firsthand? Nakamura's transformation wasn't just about changing his mind about Americans. It was about learning to question everything he thought he knew, to examine his beliefs against the evidence of his own eyes. In our increasingly polarized world, his story has profound relevance. Share in the comments, have you ever had an experience that completely changed your perspective on a group of people? What was it like to discover that your preconceptions were wrong? In August 1945, as news of Japan's surrender filtered through the prisoner of war facilities, Nakamura faced the prospect of returning home to a defeated nation. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had ended the war, but they had also destroyed any possibility of the glorious victory that Japanese propaganda had promised.
The news of Hiroshima's destruction was particularly devastating to Nakamura. His parents lived there, his school was there, his entire life before the war had been centered on that city. American authorities allowed Red Cross personnel to help prisoners send messages home, and Nakamura spent agonizing weeks waiting for word about his family's fate. When the message finally came, his parents had survived, living in a refugee camp outside the city, Nakamura experienced a complex mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that his family was alive. Guilt that he had been safe in American custody while his loved ones endured the atomic attack and its aftermath. Dr. Patterson, who had continued to check on Nakamura throughout his extended recovery, found him weeping quietly in his bed after receiving news of his parents' survival. "Good news, I hope?" Patterson asked gently. "They live," Nakamura replied in English, his vocabulary much improved after months of conversation with American personnel.
but their city, gone. Patterson sat down beside the bed, his face grave. I'm sorry. I know Hiroshima was your home. What struck Nakamura was the genuine sadness in the American doctor's voice. This man who had spent the war treating victims of Japanese aggression was expressing sincere sympathy for the suffering of Japanese civilians. It was yet another example of the moral complexity that Nakamura had discovered in American character, the ability to maintain compassion for enemies even while fighting them. As preparations began for repatriating Japanese prisoners, Nakamura found himself dreading his return home. How could he explain what he had experienced to people who had endured years of bombing, starvation, and propaganda? How could he describe American kindness to a population that had been taught to hate everything American? More troubling still was his own internal transformation. The man who had returned to Japan was fundamentally different from the one who had left. His political beliefs, his understanding of morality and honor, his entire worldview had been rebuilt from the ground up during his months in American custody. Other Japanese prisoners were grappling with similar challenges. Lieutenant Harada, the kamikaze pilot whose life had been saved by American doctors, struggled with the contradiction between his mission to die for the emperor and his gratitude for American medical care. Sergeant Yamada wondered how he could face his family knowing that he owed his life to the men he had been trained to see as demons. The American medical staff seemed to understand these internal conflicts. Dr. Patterson, during one of his final conversations with Nakamura, addressed the issue directly. You're going home to a country that's been defeated, occupied, transformed. That's got to be difficult for any soldier. I do not know what I am anymore. In Japan, I was soldier, teacher, son. Here, you made me see I am just human being. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. Maybe that's the most important thing to be. In September 1945, Nakamura boarded a transport ship bound for Japan. As American territory faded behind him, he carried more than just personal belongings. He carried memories that would shape the rest of his life, experiences that had fundamentally altered his understanding of human nature and moral possibility. The Japan he returned to was a shattered nation. Cities lay in ruins, the economy was destroyed, and the population struggled with the psychological trauma of total defeat. The emperor had announced surrender in a radio broadcast that many Japanese heard for the first time. His voice had previously been considered too sacred for ordinary citizens to hear. Nakamura reunited with his parents in the refugee camp outside Hiroshima's ruins. The city where he had taught, where he had grown up, where his entire pre-war life had been centered, was gone. In its place was a landscape of twisted metal and ash, a testament to the terrible power of the weapons that had ended the war. His parents were initially suspicious of his survival. In a culture where death was preferable to capture, returning prisoners faced suspicion and sometimes ostracism. But as Nakamura told his story, carefully, quietly, to family members he trusted, he began to plant seeds of a different understanding about their former enemies. His mother wept when he described Dr. Patterson's care, the countless hours spent saving his life, the gentle treatment he had received during his recovery. His father, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, struggled to reconcile these stories with his own experiences of military conflict. "How can this be?" his father asked. "They are supposed to be barbarians." "That is what we were told, but what I experienced was different." Nakamura returned to teaching in 1947, working in a small school built in the ruins of Hiroshima. The occupation authorities, led by General MacArthur, were implementing democratic reforms and encouraging educational changes that emphasized peace and international understanding. In his mathematics and literature classes, Nakamura began sharing subtle lessons about the complexity of human nature, the dangers of propaganda, and the importance of judging people by their actions rather than their nationality. He never spoke directly about his wartime experiences. That would have been too dangerous in the immediate post-war period. But his teaching carried a message of tolerance and understanding that influenced hundreds of students over the years. Some of his former fellow prisoners had similar experiences. Lieutenant Harada became a pilot for Japan Airlines, helping to rebuild his country's civilian aviation industry. He often spoke to young pilots about the importance of precision and care in their work, lessons that he had learned from watching American medical personnel save lives with meticulous attention to detail.
Sergeant Yamada returned to his family's farm and eventually became a local leader in agricultural cooperative movements that emphasized collaboration and mutual aid. The spirit of cooperation he had witnessed in American medical facilities influenced his approach to community building throughout his life. Meanwhile, the American medical personnel who had treated these Japanese prisoners returned to their own lives, often carrying their own transformed perspectives. Dr. Patterson resumed his practice in Minnesota, but he never forgot the Japanese officer whose life he had saved on Iwo Jima. In later interviews, Patterson would describe the experience as one of the most important of his medical career. War strips away everything non-essential, he reflected. In that operating room, there was no Japanese or American, no enemy or ally. There was just a young man who needed help, and I was qualified to provide it. Corpsman O'Brien returned to his teaching career in Boston, but his experiences with Japanese prisoners had given him a global perspective that influenced his educational approach. He became known for his ability to help students understand different cultures and perspectives, drawing on his wartime experiences with former enemies who had become friends. The statistical legacy was also significant. Post-war analyses revealed that American medical care for enemy wounded in the Pacific Theater had saved thousands of lives. These men returned to Japan with stories that contradicted wartime propaganda and helped lay the groundwork for the peaceful relationship between former enemies that developed in the decades following the war. The story of Lieutenant Nakamura and Dr. Patterson speaks to timeless truths about human nature and moral choice. In an era of global conflict and ideological division, their experience offers lessons that transcend the specific historical context of World War II. Perhaps most importantly, their story demonstrates the power of direct human contact to break down barriers of prejudice and misunderstanding. Nakamura's transformation was not the result of propaganda or political persuasion. It came from witnessing American values in action, from experiencing firsthand the compassion and professionalism of people he had been taught to hate. The story also illustrates the importance of maintaining moral principles even in the most difficult circumstances. Dr. Patterson's decision to operate on enemy wounded was not strategically necessary. It would have been militarily logical to focus all resources on American casualties. But his commitment to medical ethics, to the fundamental value of human life, created a moment of moral clarity that had lasting impact far beyond the operating room. For Americans, the story serves as a reminder of the power of living up to stated values even when it's difficult or costly. The medical care provided to Japanese prisoners was not publicized, was not used for propaganda purposes, and offered no immediate strategic advantage. It was simply the right thing to do, a reflection of American ideals put into practice under the most challenging conditions. The image that endures from Nakamura's story is not of surgical instruments or hospital beds, but of a moment of recognition between former enemies. When Dr. Patterson looked at the wounded Japanese officer on his operating table, he saw not a faceless enemy, but a fellow human being in need of help. When Nakamura recovered consciousness and realized that American doctors had saved his life, he began to see beyond the propaganda and prejudice to the humanity of people he had been taught to despise. That moment of recognition, repeated thousands of times in American medical facilities across the Pacific, helped lay the foundation for one of history's most remarkable transformations, the conversion of bitter enemies into peaceful allies. The doctors and patients who shared those experiences carried with them a different understanding of what was possible between peoples and nations. In our own time, when division and misunderstanding seemed to dominate public discourse, the story of Lieutenant Nakamura and Dr. Patterson offers a different model. It suggests that even the deepest conflicts can be transcended through acts of compassion, that even the most bitter enemies can discover their shared humanity. Their story reminds us that the most important victories are not won on battlefields, but in moments when we choose to see our common humanity despite our differences. Sometimes the greatest courage is not in fighting, but in healing. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a sword, but a surgeon's scalpel wielded in service of life rather than death. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. These forgotten moments of grace remind us of what we're capable of at our best. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what acts of unexpected kindness have you witnessed that restored your faith in humanity? Your stories might inspire others to see past their own prejudices and divisions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.